Okay, we're going to go ahead and start on chapter 10. It's on page 26. I'm not really going to analyze a lot of these chapters because it's really just describing the Tuck's home. But you need to make sure that you don't get lost in the details and you just kind of really take in as they're describing this house and how Winnie's comparing her house to the Tuck's house. Also notice how being in the Tuck's house makes her feel. It makes her feel a very certain way. So be paying attention to that as well. Also, be looking for the sensory language within this chapter. There is a ton of fantastic sensory language. But here we go. So page 26, chapter 10, in Tuck Everlasting. Winnie had grown up with order. She was used to it. Under the pitiless double assaults of her mother and grandmother, the cottage where she lived was always squeaking clean, mopped and swept and scoured into limp submission. There was no room for carelessness, no putting things off until later. The Foster women had made a fortress out of duty. Within it, they were indomitable, and Winnie was in training. So she was unprepared for the homely little house beside the pond, unprepared for the gentle eddies of dust, the silver cobwebs, the mouse who lived and welcomed to him, in a drawer. There were only 3 rooms. The kitchen came first, with an open cabinet where dishes were stacked in perilous towers without the least regard for their varying dimensions. There was an enormous black stove and a metal sink, and every surface, every wall, was piled and strewn and hung with everything imaginable, from onions to lanterns to wooden spoons and washtubs. And in a corner stood Tuck's forgotten shotgun. The parlor came next, where the furniture, loose and slopping with age, was set about helter-skelter. An ancient green plush sofa lolled alone in the center, like yet another mossy fallen log, facing a soot-streaked fireplace still deep in last winter's ashes. The table with the drawer that housed the mouse was pushed off, also alone, into a far corner, and 3 armchairs and an elderly rocker stood about aimlessly like strangers at a party, ignoring each other. Beyond this was the bedroom, where a vast and tipsy brass bed took up most of the space, but there was room beside it for a washstand with the lonely mirror, and opposite its foot a cavernous oak wardrobe from which leaked the faint smell of camphor. Up a steep flight of narrow stairs was a dusty loft. "That's where the boys sleep when they're home," May explained, and that was all. And yet it was not quite all, for there was everywhere evidence of their activities. May's and Tuck's, her sewing, patches and scraps of bright cloth, half-completed quilts and braided rugs, a bag of cotton batting with wisps of its contents like snow drifting into cracks and corners. The arms of the sofa webbed with strands of thread and dangerous with needles. His carvings, curly shavings furring the floor, and little heaps of splinters and chips, every surface dim with the sawdust of countless sandings. Limbs of unassembled dolls and wooden soldiers, a ship model propped on the mouse's table waiting for its glue to dry, and a stack of wooden bowls, their sides smooth to velvet, the topmost bowl filled with a jumble of big wooden spoons and forks like dry bleached bones. "We make things to sell," said May, surveying the mess approvingly. And still this was not all, for on the old beaming ceiling of the parlor, streaks of light swam and danced and wavered like a bright mirage, reflecting through the windows from the sunlit surface of the pond. There were bowls of daisies everywhere, gay white and yellow, and over everything was the clean, sweet smell of the water and its weeds, the chatter of swooping kingfisher, the carol and trill of a dozen other kind of birds, and occasionally the thrilling bass note of an unastonished bullfrog at ease somewhere along the muddy banks. Into it all came Winnie, eyes wide and very much amazed. It was a whole new idea to her that people could live in such disarray, but at the same time, she was charmed. It was comfortable. Climbing behind May up the stairs to see the loft, she thought to herself, maybe it's because they think they have forever to clean it up. And this was followed by another thought, far more revolutionary. Maybe they just don't care. "The boys don't be home very much," said May as they came up into the half light of the loft. "But when they are, they bed up here. There's plenty of room." The loft was cluttered too, with all kinds of odds and ends, but there were 2 mattresses rolled out on the floor, and fresh sheets and blankets were folded almost neatly on each other, waiting to be spread. "Where do they go when they're away?" asked Winnie. "What do they do?" "Oh," said May, "they go different places, do different things. They work at jobs they can get, try to bring home some of their money. Miles can do carpentering, and he's a pretty fair blacksmith, too. Jesse now, he don't ever seem to get too settled in himself. Course he's young." She stopped and smiled. "That sounds funny, don't it? Still, it's true, just the same. So Jesse, he does what strikes him at the moment, working in the fields or in the saloons, things like that. Whatever he comes across. But they can't stay on in one place for long, you know. None of us can. People get to wondering," she sighed. "We've been in this house about as long as we dare, going on 20 years. It's a right nice place. Tuck's got so he's real attached to it. Then, too, it's off by itself, plenty of fish in the pond, not too far from the towns around. When we need things, we go sometimes to one, sometimes to the next. So people don't come to notice us much. And we sell where we can. But I guess we'll be moving on one of these days. It's just about time." It sounded rather sad to Winnie never to belong anywhere. "That's too bad," she said, glancing shyly at May. "Always moving around and never having any friends or anything." But May shrugged off this observation. "Tuck and me, we got each other," she said, "and that's a lot. The boys now, they go their separate ways. They're some different, don't always get on too good. But they come home whenever the spirit moves, and every 10 years, first week of August, they meet at the spring and come home all together, so we can all be a family again for a little while. That's why we was there this morning. One way or another, it all works out." She folded her arms and nodded, more to herself than to Winnie. "Life's got to be lived, no matter how long or short," she said calmly. "You got to take what comes. We just go along like everybody else, one day at a time. Funny, we don't feel no different. Leastwise, I don't. Sometimes I forget what's happened to us, forget it altogether. And then sometimes it comes over me and I wonder why it happened to us. We're plain as salt, us Tucks. We don't deserve no blessings, if it is a blessing. And likewise, I don't see how we deserve to be cursed, if it's a curse. Still, there's no use trying to figure out why things fall the way they do. Things just are, and fussing don't bring changes. Tuck now, he's got a few other ideas, but I expect he'll tell you. There, the boys are in from the pond." When he heard a burst of voices downstairs, and in a moment, Miles and Jessie were climbing to the loft. "Here, child," said May hastily. "Hide your eyes. Boys, are you decent? What'd you put on to swim in? I got Winnie up here. Do you hear me?" "For goodness sake, Ma," said Jessie, emerging from the stairwell. "You think we're going to march around in our all-together with Winnie Foster in the house?" And Miles behind him said, "We just jumped in with our clothes on, too hot and too tired to shut 'em." It was true. They stood there side by side with their wet clothes plastered to their skins, little pools of water collecting at their feet. "Well," said May, relieved. "All right, find something dry to put on. Your pa's got supper nearly ready." And she hustled Winnie down the narrow stairs. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and start chapter 11, page 30. It was a good supper, flapjacks, bacon, bread, and applesauce. But they ate sitting about in the parlor instead of around a table. Winnie had never had a meal that way before, and she watched them carefully at first to see what the rules might be that she did not know about. But there seemed to be no rules. Jessie sat on the floor and used the seat of the chair for a table, but the others held their plates in their laps. There were no napkins. It was all right then to lick the maple syrup from your fingers. Winnie was never allowed to do such a thing at home, but she'd always thought it would be the easiest way, and suddenly the meal seemed luxurious. After a few minutes, however, it was clear to Winnie that there was at least one rule. As long as there was food to eat, there was no conversation. All 4 Tucks kept their eyes and their attention on the business at hand. And in the silence, given time to think, Winnie felt her elation and her thoughtless pleasure wobble and collapse. It had been different when they were out of doors, where the world belonged to everyone and no one. Here, everything was theirs alone. Everything was done their way. Eating, she realized now, was a very personal thing, not something to do with strangers. Chewing was a personal thing, yet here she was, eating with strangers in a strange place. She shivered a little and frowned, looking round at them. That story they had told her? Why, they were crazy, she thought harshly, and they were criminals. They had kidnapped her right out of the middle of her very own wood, and now she would be expected to sleep all night in this dirty, peculiar house. She had never slept in any bed but her own in her whole life. All these thoughts flowed at once from the dark part of her mind. She put down her fork and said unsteadily, "I want to go home." The Tuck stopped eating and looked at her surprised. May said soothingly, "Why, of course you do, child. That's only natural. I'll take you home. I promised I would. Soon as we explained a bit as to why you got to promise you'll never tell about the spring. That's the only reason we brung you here. We got to make you see why." Then Miles said cheerfully and with sudden sympathy, "There's a pretty good old rowboat. I'll take you out for a row after supper." "No, I will," said Jessie. "Let me. I found her first, didn't I, Winnie Foster?" "Listen, I'll show you where the frogs are, and—" "Hush," Tuck interrupted. "Everyone hush. I'll take Winnie rowing on the pond. There's a good deal to be said, and I think we better hurry up and say it. I got a feeling there ain't a whole lot of time." Jessie laughed at this and ran a hand roughly through his curls. "That's funny, Pa. Seems to me like time's the only thing we got a lot of." But May frowned. "You worried, Tuck? What's got you? No one saw us on the way up. Well, wait a bit. Yes, they did. Come to think of it, there was a man on the road just outside Tree Gap, but he didn't say nothing." "He knows me, though," said Winnie. She had forgotten, too, about the man in the yellow suit, and now, thinking of him, she felt a surge of relief. "He'll tell my father he saw me." "He knows you?" said May, her frown deepening. "But you didn't call out to him, child. Why not?" "I was too scared to do anything," said Winnie honestly. Tuck shook his head. "I never thought we'd come to the place where we'd be scaring children," he said. "I guess there's no way to make it up to you, Winnie, but I'm sure most awful sorry it had to happen like that. Who was this man you saw?" "I don't know his name," said Winnie, "but he's a pretty nice man, I guess. In fact, he seems supremely nice to her now, a kind of savior." And then she added, "He came to our house last night, but he didn't go inside." "Well, that don't sound too serious, Pa," said Miles. "Just some stranger passing by." "Just the same, we got to get you home again, Winnie," said Tuck, standing up decisively. "We got to get you home just as fast as we can. I got a feeling this whole thing is about to come apart like wet bread. But first, we got to talk, and the pond's the best place. The pond's got answers. Come along, child. Let's go out on the water."